The 1950s, a time of prosperity but not equality. The American people were thrust into political change and social turmoil.
In 1955, a 14-year-old boy named Emmett Till was brutally beaten and shot to death by a couple of white males in Mississippi because he was accused of flirtatiously calling after a white store clerk, Carolyn Bryant. Seeing Till's body on the front pages of the nation's African-American newspapers was a visceral experience for Americans. Because many African-American men fought for freedom in the Second World War, they expected to get their share. In return, African-Americans were on the receiving end of disrespect, discrimination, and segregation. Although the judicial victory of Brown versus the Board of Education in 1954 was a step towards equality, it was not enough because the doctrine neither had an enforcement mechanism nor did it establish a clear distinction between discrimination and competitive education practices. It was time for a movement. The Civil Rights Movement is a term that describes the period between the 1950s and 1960s in the United States in which African Americans fought for voting rights and the cessation of segregation. Eisenhower and Kennedy stalled the Civil Rights Movement by avoiding controversial issues, but Kennedy's tragic death expedited the movement by replacing his unclear stance and timid maneuvers with Johnson's firm position and cutthroat negotiation tactics, leading to legislation that changed America forever.
In Montgomery, Alabama in 1955, a white man asked Rosa Parks to move so that he could sit in her spot on a city bus. Montgomery's discriminatory ordinances stated that an African American had to give up their seat to a white person if they asked, but Parks refused and was promptly arrested. The African American community started a boycott of the city transportation systems led by civil rights leader Martin Luther King Jr., eventually integrating city buses. This shed a light on the bright leader of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference who could put pressure on politicians for civil rights legislation.
In 1960, John F. Kennedy and Richard Nixon took part in the first televised presidential debate in America. A prominent theme discussed was civil rights. Kennedy was quick to say,
"I'm not satisfied until every American enjoys his full constitutional rights."
However, Kennedy's outward support for civil rights did not parallel his private stance on the issue, resulting in a discrepancy in historian literature between what Kennedy accomplished for the movement and how he discussed civil rights behind closed doors. Historians such as James W. Riddlesberger, Robert Weisbrot, and Nikhil Paul Singh blatantly assume that Kennedy always supported civil rights and the March on Washington, as his legacy is based on equality. However, Janice Hamlet observes that Kennedy only supported the march when he realized its success. In private, Kennedy was less enthusiastic about civil rights reform, as he was fearful of revolt and resistance from southern states. In a letter from a Birmingham jail, MLK Jr. writes about Kennedy's timidness towards the movement, saying, quote, "First, I must confess that over the past few years I have been gravely disappointed with the white moderate. I have almost reached the regrettable conclusion that the great stumbling block toward freedom is not the white citizen's counselor or the Ku Klux Klaner, but the white moderate, who is more devoted to order than to justice, who prefers a negative peace, which is the absence of tension, to a positive peace, which is the presence of justice." End quote.
Even though Kennedy was more preoccupied with foreign policy crises such as Berlin, Cuba, and Vietnam than with civil rights, there were many controversial events where race was pertinent and Kennedy was forced to take action. In 1961, Freedom Riders rode buses south to protest segregation of interstate bus terminals. They were met with fire bombings from the KKK. In 1962, Kennedy sent the National Guard to the University of Mississippi to ensure that an African-American student, James Meredith, was allowed to attend the fall semester. In 1963, the police brutality at the Birmingham, Alabama demonstrations was televised, which made apparent Southern racism, forcing Kennedy to push civil rights to the forefront of his domestic policy goals. Additionally, Russian accusations of American hypocrisy during the Cold War put pressure on Kennedy to pursue civil rights legislation.
In early 1963, civil rights leaders King and Randolph met with Kennedy at the White House to discuss a march on Washington. Kennedy opposed the march because he believed it would further divide the country because of Southern backlash. The leaders refused to cancel, marching on August 28, 1963, and Kennedy finally gave his support only after he saw the success of the march. Kennedy's decisions on civil rights were purely political. He gave speeches that electrified the nation, but when it came to firm political action, he was inept. The increased unrest surrounding civil rights forced Kennedy to present a comprehensive bill to the House of Representatives in June of 1963. The bill included protection of voting rights, the disallowance of segregation in public accommodations, and the ability of the Attorney General to take legal action against states that broke civil rights laws. Although the bill had bipartisan support, it was stalled in the Rules Committee by a Virginia Dixiecrat, Howard Smith.
In contrast to Kennedy's moderate leadership style, Vice President Lyndon B. Johnson was a force for change. Johnson, a Texas-born Democrat, was an outspoken advocate of the civil rights movement. When discussing Johnson, political commentator James Reston said, quote, "Johnson has, on the race problem, been the most effective mediator in Congress between the North and South." End quote. Because Johnson was from the South, he could persuade congressmen to be in favor of equal rights. In contrast, Kennedy was just another Northerner pushing for civil rights. When Johnson lost to Kennedy in the 1960 primary elections, Johnson begrudgingly accepted the vice presidency. Johnson felt restricted with the powers he held as vice president and privately criticized the way in which Kennedy ran his administration. He knew the inner workings of Congress especially well. Then, on November 22, 1963, everything changed. Just after Kennedy had started publicly supporting a civil rights agenda, he was assassinated in Texas. Lyndon B. Johnson became the President of the United States.
Johnson, obtaining his long-awaited political control, took full advantage of Kennedy's passing. At his first presidential address, he said,
"The dream of equal rights for all Americans, whatever their race or color."
Johnson could persuade Congress to pass the Civil Rights Bill because he derived legitimacy from the legacy of a fallen hero. He framed the bill as a solution to the terror of a nation with a deceased leader. As Kennedy was heavily involved in civil rights issues like freedom rides, the protection of James Meredith, the Birmingham riot, and the March on Washington, Johnson could easily portray the Civil Rights Act as an obligation to honor Kennedy's memory. Essentially, Kennedy's assassination gave Johnson the authority to guilt-trip every congressman and senator into voting for the Civil Rights Act, or label them as against Kennedy in elections, expediting passage of the bill.
These and other American dreams have been vitalized by his drive and by his dedication. And now the ideas and the ideals which he so nobly represented must and will be translated into effective action.
Johnson's knowledge of the inner workings of Congress allowed him to bypass the Rules Committee by encouraging the chairman of the House Judiciary Committee to take out the bill. After an arduous legislative battle, the bill passed the House in February of 1964. The Senate Judiciary Committee head, James Eastland, was a segregationist and would have easily stalled the bill, but Johnson pushed Senate Majority Leader Mike Mansfield into filibustering. The segregationists held a record 57-day filibuster in response, but there was simply nothing Southern Democrats could do. Finally, on June 10, 1964, the bill was passed.
Enacted on July 2nd, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was a defining moment in American history. By legally ending segregation and voting discrimination, the act provides a basis for those in need of civil liberty. The televised March on Selma put pressure on Johnson to follow up the 1964 Act with the Voting Rights Act passed on August 6, 1965. Kennedy's torn viewpoint would have easily carried through his presidency had that unthinkable tragedy not occurred, translating to the continued stalling of the bill. But tragedy led to triumph. An assassinated leader spurred civil rights legislation promoting true liberty and justice for all.